452-year-old Dawn Walker, October 27, 2021, was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. The mother of three and grandmother of three had found love again with Thomas Nutt, and they were celebrating their wedding at a registry office in Halifax. Friends and family gathered at the Prince Albert pub in Brighouse for the reception, toasting the newlyweds as they began their life together. But Dawn seemed different that day, nervous. Her hands were trembling, and those closest to her noticed she didn't look happy. At 10:30 p.m. that evening, a taxi dropped the couple at their home on Shirley Grove in Lightcliffe. Dawn Walker was captured on CCTV for the last time at 10:36 p.m. She would never be seen alive again. From the moment she woke up, she was shaking constantly. She said, "I think something bad is going to happen." And she said, "No, Thomas has killed your mom." So I called my sister and said, "Mike, mom's dead." Dawn Walker was described by those who knew her as having a beautiful soul. She was lively and energetic, the kind of person who would give you her last penny, even if she was struggling herself. Her daughter Cody would later say that Dawn once paid for a disabled man's shopping when he was short of money. That was just who she was. It was a simple gesture, but it perfectly captured Dawn's character. Dawn had three daughters, Cody Shaw, Kiri Guest, and a third daughter. She was also a devoted grandmother to three grandsons who adored her. Family was everything to Dawn, and she was known for her generosity and warmth in her community in Lightcliffe near Halifax. Those who knew Dawn said she never missed a birthday. She would call everyone, acquaintances, best friends, family members, to wish them well. She was the type of person who remembered the little things that mattered to people. Dawn lived in a 3-bedroom bungalow on Shirley Grove in Lightcliffe. The area was home to many young families, and Dawn had integrated well into the community since moving there. She was known locally for selling Avon and Tupperware products, which gave her an excuse to chat with neighbors and build friendships. Within weeks of moving to Shirley Grove, she'd held a barbecue to meet her new neighbors. This was typical Dawn, always reaching out, always wanting to connect with people. But behind her bright smile, Dawn was fighting her own battles. She suffered from bipolar disorder and depression, conditions that affected her daily life but never dimmed her generous spirit. These mental health struggles would later be cruelly weaponized against her by the very man who was supposed to protect her. The close-knit community that surrounded Dawn would later rally around her family when tragedy struck. Neighbors collected £5,000 for her funeral costs, showing just how much she was loved and respected in the area. But in the months leading up to her death, some of those same neighbors had become increasingly concerned about what they were witnessing at 33 Shirley Grove. As a relationship quickly became something much darker. "I think she just wanted someone to be with her and love her," her daughter Kiri Lee would later say. Kiri told a court that Nutt moved in with her mother very quickly, and everything spiraled from there. For Dawn's family, this was the beginning of a nightmare that would last 3 years and end in the most horrific way imaginable. Thomas Nutt was 45 years old when he met Dawn, but his history of violence stretched back decades. He'd first been convicted of grievous bodily harm at just 17 years old. In the 1990s, he'd served long prison sentences for robberies. In the early 2000s, he spent 16 weeks in jail for deliberately driving into another woman's car in a road rage incident. Between 2005 and 2015, Nutt had been in a relationship with Kimberly Alcock. They met at a traveling fairground in Retford, Nottinghamshire, and moved in together shortly afterward. Their relationship produced 3 children and a decade of escalating violence. For the first few years, Kimberly said Nutt was lovely to her, never violent or aggressive. But that changed after their first child was born, just 2 days after Kimberly gave birth. The couple had a disagreement about their baby's name. Nutt simply went mad, she later told Bradford Crown Court. He punched her repeatedly in the face, took her phone, and refused to let her leave the house. The violence continued throughout their relationship. In 2009 he attacked her again. But it was the final assault in 2015 that showed just how dangerous Thomas Nutt could be. Kimberly described how he grabbed her by the throat while she was in bed, strangling her while punching her. He dragged her out of bed and continued the assault, restricting her airways until she thought she was going to die. Kimberly described Nutt as having a deep hatred of women and being a Jekyll and Hyde character. She said he could be very loving and pleasant, but when he lost his temper he would go mad. When that happened, he became so focused on his anger that nothing would get through to him and nothing would calm him down. After the 2015 assault, Nutt was convicted, and Kimberly was granted a restraining order. But even then his control continued. While she was living in a safe house, he somehow managed to send 3 smashed Easter eggs with the message, "Did the kids enjoy Easter?" "I've had restraining order after restraining order just to keep us safe from him," Kimberly would later say. "He's a psychopath." When Dawn Walker entered into a relationship with Thomas Nutt, the warning signs were there from the very beginning. Dawn's daughter, Kiri Lee, was just 18 when she was essentially kicked out of the family home because of her arguments with Nutt. She said he didn't like women, respected men more, and wouldn't shout at men. The controlling behavior escalated quickly. Neighbors noticed that Dawn and Nutt were arguing constantly. When Kiri Lee returned from Egypt for a holiday in 2020, she found her mother was ill, and Nutt was shouting at her, telling Dawn she was a different person because her daughter was there. It was like a holiday from hell. "He started shouting in my mom's face upstairs," Kiri recalled. "He was following her everywhere and I got tired of it. So I went upstairs and started arguing with Thomas about how he needed to respect my mom. His facial features just changed. His eyes widened and he pinned me up against a wall. He then gripped my head and smashed it against the corner of a wall." By 2020, the violence had begun. Neighbors saw Dawn with a massive black eye and cuts to her face. Her lips and cheeks were cut and heavily swollen. It was clear to everyone who saw her that she'd been badly beaten. In August 2020, Nutt nearly killed Dawn in an attack so severe that she told others he'd nearly killed her. He was arrested and charged, but Dawn eventually retracted her statements, and the charges were dropped. Perhaps the most chilling incident occurred on August 25, 2021, just 2 months before their wedding. A neighbor, Malcolm Crowe, heard noises coming from Dawn's house around 4:30 a.m. When he went to investigate, he found Dawn in clear distress. Nutt appeared at the top of the stairs and claimed Dawn was having an asthma attack, but Dawn looked directly at her neighbor and said, "Don't believe him. He's trying to kill me." She later told friends that her ribs were killing her and that he'd broken her ribs. Once again, Nutt was arrested. Once again, Dawn retracted her statements. The cycle of violence, arrest, and retraction was becoming predictable. Each time, the system failed to protect Dawn because she was too afraid to follow through with the charges. And each time, Nutt's confidence grew that he could continue his abuse without consequence. In July 2020, Dawn had reached out to someone who could understand what she was going through: Kimberly Alcock, Nutt's ex-partner. Dawn had discovered that Kimberly had a restraining order against Nutt and wanted to know why. Kimberly told Dawn everything. She showed her photographs of the injuries Nutt had inflicted on her and warned Dawn about his violent temper. Most importantly, she told Dawn, "He will end up killing you one day. Get out." Dawn confided in Kimberly that Nutt scared the hell out of her. The two women stayed in contact over social media, with Dawn occasionally reaching out when things were particularly bad. After the August 2020 attack, Dawn told Kimberly that Nutt had nearly killed her, but then she said she loved him. Kimberly's last message to Dawn was asking if she was going to be okay. Dawn never replied. Nutt had blocked Kimberly from Dawn's social media accounts, cutting off this vital support network. Even Dawn's neighbors could see that something was terribly wrong. In the week before her wedding, Dawn sent a message to her neighbor June asking, "Is it just nerves, June, or is my gut instinct telling me to get the hell out and run?" June replied that it could just be wedding nerves. If only she'd known how right Dawn's instincts were. A week before the wedding, Dawn told her daughter, Kiri Lee, that she had a feeling something bad was going to happen to her. It was as if Dawn knew that her wedding day would also be her last day alive. October 27, 2021, should have been a celebration. Dawn Walker and Thomas Nutt were married at a registry office in Halifax, surrounded by friends and family who believed they were witnessing the start of a new chapter in Dawn's life. The ceremony was followed by a reception at the Prince Albert pub in Brighouse, where guests toasted the newlyweds and wished them happiness. But those who attended the wedding noticed that something wasn't quite right. Dawn seemed nervous and was visibly shaking throughout the day. She didn't look like a happy bride. Instead, she appeared anxious and distracted, as if she was going through the motions rather than celebrating one of the most important days of her life. Friends and family later described Dawn as looking uncomfortable and unhappy on what should have been her special day. Some attributed it to wedding nerves. After all, getting married is a big step for anyone. But others sensed that Dawn's anxiety went deeper than typical pre-wedding jitters. The celebration continued into the evening, with guests unaware of the tragedy that was about to unfold. Music played, drinks flowed, and people danced, creating memories of what they thought was a joyous occasion. None of them knew they were attending what would essentially become Dawn's wake. At around 10:30 p.m., as the evening was winding down, the newlyweds decided to head home. They called a taxi to take them back to their house on Shirley Grove in Lightcliff. The journey was short, just a few miles from the pub to their home. The taxi driver later told police that the couple seemed quiet during the journey. There was no conversation, no laughter, none of the excitement you might expect from newlyweds heading home after their wedding celebration. Instead, there was an atmosphere of tension that even a stranger could sense. At 10:36 p.m., the taxi pulled up outside 33 Shirley Grove. CCTV cameras captured the moment Dawn Walker stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward her front door. It would be the last time she was ever seen alive. Within hours, the woman who had just celebrated her wedding would be dead at the hands of the man she had just married. Neighbor Malcolm Crowe was in his living room around 11 p.m. when he heard noises coming from next door. The sounds were concerning, not the usual domestic noise you might expect from a couple returning from their wedding celebration, but something more disturbing. For about an hour, Malcolm heard bumps and thumps coming through the walls, but crucially he heard no voices. There were no shouts, no screams, no sounds of conversation or argument. This suggested that whatever was happening next door was one-sided, that Dawn had been quickly overpowered and was unable to cry out for help. Sometime between 11 p.m. and midnight on her wedding night, Dawn Walker was murdered by the man she had just married. The woman who had walked down the aisle just hours earlier, who had exchanged vows and rings, who had been toasted by friends and family, was now lying dead in her own bedroom. What Thomas Nutt did to Dawn Walker on their wedding night was an act of unimaginable brutality. The post-mortem examination would later reveal that Dawn had suffered extensive injuries in a violent assault. The forensic evidence showed that Dawn had been beaten and then strangled with considerable force. The pathologist determined that the attack had been deliberate and sustained. Evidence also showed that Dawn had tried to defend herself, but at 52 years old and much smaller than Nutt, she was no match for his size and strength. The attack appeared to have taken place in the bedroom, which meant that Dawn was cornered with no escape route. She would have been trapped, unable to flee or call for help. What made the murder even more chilling was that it took place just hours after Dawn and Nutt had exchanged wedding vows. The man who had promised to love and cherish her had instead killed her in their bedroom. After murdering his wife, Nutt faced a practical problem: what to do with her body. His solution revealed the cold, calculating nature of his character. Rather than calling for help or showing any remorse for what he had done, he immediately began planning how to cover up his crime. What Thomas Nutt did after murdering his wife was almost as shocking as the murder itself. He embarked on what prosecutors would later call a ghastly charade designed to cover up his crime and deflect suspicion. First, he hid Dawn's body in a kitchen cupboard. At 1 a.m. on October 28, just hours after murdering Dawn, he sent text messages from her mobile phone to her daughter. The messages were clearly not from Dawn. They were not in her language or style. Nutt spent the early hours washing clothes that he had worn on the night Dawn died. CCTV later captured him at 5:10 p.m. hanging washing in the back garden, clothes that had been washed just hours after his wife's murder. Then, in a grotesque mockery of a honeymoon, Nutt traveled alone to Skegness with their caravan. He told neighbors and friends that Dawn had wanted to go on their honeymoon as planned. All the while, Dawn's body remained hidden in the kitchen cupboard at their home. On October 31st, Halloween, Nutt returned and spent the morning putting up Halloween decorations around the house, including police tape. Dawn's corpse was still hidden inside. When Dawn failed to appear for a planned meeting with her daughter at a Wilco store, Nutt made a 999 call at lunchtime, reporting her missing. He told police that Dawn had mental health problems and painted himself as the worried husband who had no idea where his wife could be. The performance that Thomas Nutt put on after reporting Dawn missing was particularly cruel. He took Dawn's daughter, Kiri Lee, and her young son out to search for Dawn, knowing all along that she was dead and hidden in their house. Kiri Lee would later describe the horror of this experience. "So now that I know what happened, when I was in Mom's house feeding my son, she was in the cupboard and we weren't even 2 meters apart." They visited local shops, hospitals, and searched the neighborhood, with Nutt playing the part of the concerned stepfather. The cruelest part came when they returned to the house. "He then took me back to the house and I prepared my son's lunch in the same spot my mom had been killed so violently," Kiri told the court. Meanwhile, pressure was mounting on Nutt to allow police to search the house. Realizing that he couldn't delay much longer without appearing suspicious, Nutt knew he had to remove Dawn's body from the property. At 4:38 p.m. on October 31st, CCTV cameras showed Nutt dragging a large suitcase through his back garden. The timing was significant. It was just minutes before police officers were due to arrive at the house to conduct a search. Suspicious neighbors had noticed Nutt's unusual behavior with the suitcase. One neighbor was so concerned that they called the police with an anonymous tip, reporting seeing Nutt with the suitcase. At around 3 p.m. on October 31st, members of the public discovered Dawn's body in undergrowth near Asquith Avenue, not far from Shirley Grove. She had been dumped in the bushes and left there. That evening, Thomas Nutt handed himself into police, though even then he couldn't tell the truth about what he had done. He claimed that he had killed Dawn on October 30th, not on their wedding night, in an attempt to minimize his culpability. The investigation into Dawn Walker's murder was led by Detective Inspector Amanda Wimbles of West Yorkshire Police. She described Nutt as a seasoned, practiced liar who had constructed an elaborate web of deceit to cover up his crime. The evidence against Nutt was overwhelming. CCTV footage showed him dragging the suitcase containing Dawn's body at precisely the time when police were about to search his house. There was no CCTV evidence of Dawn leaving the house after 10:36 p.m. on their wedding night. The false text messages sent from Dawn's phone provided clear evidence of his deception. Most damning of all was the testimony of those who knew Nutt's history of violence. Kimberly Alcock bravely gave evidence about the years of abuse she had suffered at his hands. When the trial began at Bradford Crown Court in July 2022, Nutt admitted to manslaughter but denied murder. His defense team argued that he had lost his temper after Dawn told him she wanted a divorce just hours after their wedding, claiming the killing was spontaneous rather than premeditated. But prosecutor Alistair MacDonald described Nutt as a master of deceit with a tendency to attack his female partners. The prosecution argued that this was the culmination of years of escalating domestic violence. Nutt chose not to give evidence in his own defense. The prosecution argued that he had no answers for the overwhelming evidence against him. The trial lasted 11 days and heard evidence from dozens of witnesses. On August 10, 2022, after just a few hours of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict for murder. There were cheers and shouts from the public gallery as justice was finally delivered for Dawn Walker. 9 days later, Thomas Nutt was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years. To be honest, I'd have liked him to get a lot longer, but they said that was the highest sentence they could give because he'd handed himself in as well, and they have to take that into account, a family member said. The murder of Dawn Walker highlighted tragic failures in the system designed to protect victims of domestic violence. Despite multiple incidents of violence and clear warnings, Dawn was not adequately protected. In August 2020, Nutt was arrested for assaulting Dawn so severely that she told others he'd nearly killed her. But charges were dropped when Dawn retracted her statements. The pattern repeated itself in August 2021, just 2 months before their wedding. Each time charges were dropped, Nutt's confidence grew. He learned that he could assault Dawn without serious consequences. The system failed to connect the dots between Nutt's past behavior and the ongoing danger he posed to Dawn. After the trial, prosecutors noted that this was a predictable and preventable murder. The warning signs were all there, but the system failed to act decisively enough to save Dawn's life. Kimberly Alcock said, "The way he behaved with Dawn was the same as with me, but one woman survived and one didn't. I was lucky." In 2022, it was reported that Thomas Nutt had been attacked while serving his sentence at HMP Leeds. In October 2022, Nutt lodged an appeal against his conviction. Thomas Nutt took everything from Dawn Walker: her life, her dreams, her future with her daughters and grandchildren. There are no words for him. There aren't. "I hate him," Curie said. "You know, I lost my best friend. I lost my mom. I lost my son's Nana. My Nana, she basically cries every day. You know, my sister struggles to sleep. We're still a close family, but there's always a piece that's going to be missing." But he couldn't take away the memory of the beautiful, generous, loving woman she was. Please don't forget Dawn Walker. Remember her not for how she died, but for how she lived, with kindness, generosity, and love for everyone around her. Her light may have been extinguished too soon, but her memory will endure in the hearts of all those who knew and loved her. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please reach out for help. Call the National Domestic Violence Helpline or contact your local police. Dawn Walker's death was preventable. Let's make sure her story helps prevent others from suffering the same fate.